Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood in the Great Hall of Nexus Prime and watched the alien delegates shuffle into their seats. And she felt a cold weight settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the recycled air of the station. For 300 years, humanity had been part of the Galactic Council, and Elena had spent her entire career believing that this partnership meant something real and true and lasting. She had been wrong. The hall itself was a marvel of alien engineering, a massive dome that floated in the void between stars, and its walls glowed with soft blue light that was supposed to make everyone feel calm and welcome. But today, it only made Elena feel small and trapped like an animal in a cage. Around her sat the representatives of 100 different species, creatures with scales and feathers and skin that shifted colors with their moods, beings that breathed methane or lived in liquid or existed as clouds of intelligent gas. And all of them looked down at the small human delegation with eyes that held no warmth at all. The Velthari Archon named Sylveth rose from his throne at the center of the chamber, his silver skin catching the light. His forearms spread wide in a gesture that was supposed to show openness, but instead felt like a threat. He was tall, nearly 3 meters of elegant muscle and bone, and his people had ruled this council for 10,000 years, with a gentle hand that never let anyone forget who held the real power. "We gathered today to discuss matters of great importance," he announced, his voice carrying through the hall with perfect clarity, "and we ask that all members listen with open minds and willing hearts." Elena felt her assistant James shift nervously beside her, and she reached out to touch his arm in a gesture of comfort that she did not really feel herself. She had heard rumors about what was coming, whispers that had reached her through back channels and worried friends among the alien diplomatic corps, but she had hoped and prayed that they were wrong. The Zevkai Arbiter stepped forward next, a creature of hard angles and darker purposes, with compound eyes that seemed to see everything and care about nothing. And in his clawed hands, he held a data tablet that would change everything. "The Council has reviewed the status of the human species," the Arbiter announced in a voice like grinding metal, "and we have reached a decision regarding their future development and expansion." Future development. Elena wanted to stand up and scream that humanity had built starships while some of these species were still learning to use fire, that they had earned their place among the stars with blood and sacrifice and endless determination. But she stayed silent and waited for the blow to fall. "Effective immediately," the Arbiter continued without even glancing at the human delegation. "The species known as humanity is hereby reclassified under the Developmental Species Protection Act." A murmur ran through the hall, some species surprised and others nodding as if they had expected nothing less. Elena felt the blood drain from her face as she listened to the terms of their new prison. Human faster-than-light travel would be restricted to approved routes only, with Council observers on every vessel to ensure compliance. Human colonization rights were suspended indefinitely pending a review that everyone knew would never actually happen. Human military forces would be reduced to small defensive patrol craft, barely capable of protecting a single planet, let alone the 17 worlds that humanity now called home. "This is for your own protection," Archon Sylveth explained with a smile that showed too many teeth, "because younger species often overreach and hurt themselves, and we would not want to see humanity suffer for their own ambition." Elena rose to her feet, her heart pounding so hard that she could feel it in her throat, and she looked around at the assembled aliens who held the fate of her entire species in their hands. "With respect, Archon," she said in a voice that she forced to remain steady and calm, "humanity has been a faithful member of this council for 3 centuries, and we have followed every law and honored every treaty without exception." The Archon's smile did not waver. "And we appreciate your cooperation, Ambassador, which is why we are implementing these protections rather than harsher measures that some members of the Council suggested." "Harsher measures?" Elena felt sick as she imagined what that might mean: forced relocations or population controls, or the kind of quiet genocide that the Council had carried out against other species who asked too many questions. "We have 12 billion people on Earth alone," Elena continued, "and another 100 billion across our colonies, and you cannot simply cage us like animals and expect us to accept it quietly." The Arbiter made a sound that might have been laughter from a creature with a different throat. "We can do whatever the Council decides is necessary, Ambassador, because that is how the galaxy works. And your species would do well to remember that the alternative to Council membership is far worse than any restrictions we might impose." Elena sat back down because there was nothing else she could do, and she felt James squeeze her hand under the table with fingers that trembled with anger and fear. The rest of the session passed in a blur of votes and procedures that Elena barely registered, her mind racing through possibilities and plans and desperate hopes that all seemed to end in the same dark place. When it was finally over, she walked back to the human quarters in silence, ignoring the pitying looks from some species and the smug satisfaction from others. Her office was small but comfortable, decorated with pictures from Earth that now felt like images from a dream. Mountains and oceans and cities full of people who had no idea that their freedom had just been stolen from them. She sat down at her desk and stared at the communication console for a long time, before she finally reached out and activated the encryption protocols that would keep her message hidden from Council surveillance. Her fingers hesitated over the keys as she thought about what to say. How to explain to the leaders of humanity that everything they had worked for was being taken away by creatures who saw them as children at best and threats at worst. Finally, she typed 5 simple words and sent them hurtling across the stars to a small blue planet that still believed the universe could be fair. "They mean to cage us." Then she added one more line, because she had always been a soldier at heart, even when she wore diplomatic clothes. "Awaiting instructions." She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes and waited for the response that would determine whether humanity would accept their chains or fight against them. Outside her window, the stars burned cold and bright and utterly indifferent to the struggles of the small creatures who dared to reach for them. But Elena knew something that the Council had forgotten in their 10,000 years of comfortable power. Humans were never good at accepting cages. And chains, no matter how velvet, always eventually got broken by those who refused to stop pulling against them. The message light blinked as her words flew toward Earth, and Elena Vasquez, Ambassador of Humanity, sat alone in the dark and began to plan for a future that the Galactic Council would never see coming. 6 months had passed since the Council declared humanity a developmental species, and every single day had brought new humiliations that burned like fire in the hearts of 12 billion people on Earth and 100 billion more scattered across the stars. Elena Vasquez had watched her government beg and plead and negotiate, and she had watched every single effort fail against the cold wall of Council indifference. The mining operations in the Kepler Belt had been the first to fall, when Council administrators arrived without warning and declared that humans could no longer extract resources from asteroids without proper oversight, which meant alien officers watching every move and taking detailed notes about human technology. Then came the research stations, where scientists who had spent their lives studying the mysteries of the universe suddenly found themselves subjected to invasive audits by SciFi inspectors who confiscated anything they deemed too advanced for a developmental species. Human ships were stopped and searched at random, their crews forced to stand with their hands raised while alien soldiers went through their cargo and personal belongings with casual contempt. But humanity endured because that was what their leaders told them to do, because diplomacy and patience and trust in the process would eventually lead to a better outcome. Elena had stopped believing that lie 3 months ago, but she kept her mouth shut and did her job, because what else could she do? Then came the day that changed everything, The day that would be remembered in human history as the moment when patience finally died. The colony ship Amalthea was a beautiful vessel designed to carry 4,000 colonists to a new world in a system that no one else wanted. A small red star with a single habitable planet that humans had named Hope. The colonists were families mostly, parents with young children and elderly grandparents and teenagers, full of dreams about building something new and wonderful on a world that would belong to them. Elena had met some of them before they departed, had shaken hands with a woman named Sarah who was bringing her 3 daughters to Hope so they could grow up with open skies above them instead of the recycled air of orbital stations. The Amalthea was halfway to its destination when the HFY enforcement fleet appeared out of nowhere and demanded an immediate stop for an unscheduled boarding. Captain Marcus Webb, a veteran of 30 years in the merchant marine, refused because the colonists were scared and the HFY had no legal right to stop them in deep space. He tried to explain that they were following an approved route, that their paperwork was in order, that they just wanted to reach their new home in peace. The HFY fleet commander did not bother to respond with words. Instead, he gave the order to fire, and in less than a minute, the Amalthea was nothing but a cloud of debris and frozen bodies drifting in the void. 4,000 people dead, including Sarah and her 3 daughters, who had just wanted to see open skies. The council called it an unfortunate necessity. Archon Sylveth expressed his regrets in a public statement that managed to blame humanity for the tragedy while praising the HFY for their restraint. On Earth, people wept and screamed and demanded justice that everyone knew would never come. President Marcus Chun was a quiet man who had spent his career building bridges and finding common ground. And even now he tried to give the council one last chance to do the right thing. He sent a formal protest and demanded an investigation and asked for the punishment of those responsible. The council responded by sending him a list of new restrictions that would be implemented immediately, including a complete ban on human colony ships leaving established systems. That was when Marcus Chun finally understood what Elena had known for months, that the council would never treat humanity as equals, that they would keep pushing and taking until there was nothing left. He stood before the United Nations Assembly, in the Great Hall where humanity had gathered to make decisions for over 500 years. And he looked out at the representatives of every nation on Earth with eyes that had seen too much and accepted too little. The chamber was silent as he walked to the podium, and behind him, on a massive screen, was an image of the Amalthea taken before her final voyage. A beautiful ship full of beautiful people who would never reach their beautiful dream. "We came to the stars with open hands," President Chun began, his voice soft but clear. "And we asked only for the chance to grow and learn and build a future among the lights of distant suns." He paused and let the silence stretch until it was almost painful. "For 300 years we followed their rules, honored their treaties, and believed that if we were patient enough and good enough, they would eventually see us as partners instead of pets." Someone in the crowd was crying, and the sound seemed to echo through the hall like a ghost. "And for our patience, our children have been murdered." He turned to look at the image of the Amalthea, and when he turned back, his face had changed into something harder and colder than anyone had ever seen. "The council has made their position clear, and now we must make ours equally clear." He took a deep breath. "We asked for peace, and they gave us chains." Another breath. "We asked for justice, and they gave us ashes." His hands gripped the podium until his knuckles turned white. "Very well." The words fell like hammer blows in the silent chamber. "As of this moment, the United Terran government withdraws from the Galactic Council." A gasp ran through the assembly, but Chun was not finished. "We recall all ambassadors, void all treaties, and suspend all trade agreements effective immediately." He looked directly into the broadcast camera, knowing that 300 billion humans across 17 worlds were watching and waiting. To the people of Earth and every colony that carries our flag among the stars, I say this: we are alone now, but we are free. His voice rose with a passion that burned through the void between worlds. No more will we bow to those who see us as lesser beings. No more will we accept restrictions on our growth and our dreams. No more will we sacrifice our children on the altar of alien approval. He slammed his hand down on the podium. They wanted us small and scared and dependent on their mercy, but they forgot one simple truth about humanity. His eyes blazed with a fire that would not be extinguished. We did not break. The chamber erupted in cheers and tears and the sound of humans rediscovering something they had almost forgotten: pride, defiance, hope. Across the galaxy, the Galactic Council watched the broadcast with shock and disbelief, unable to understand how their compliant little humans had suddenly found their spine. Archon Sylveth laughed when he heard the news, certain that the humans would come crawling back within a decade. He was wrong. Humanity was done crawling, done begging, done accepting crumbs from the table of their betters. They were going home to prepare for whatever came next. And whatever came next would be entirely on their own terms. The galaxy expected humanity to rage and scream and throw itself against the walls of its prison in desperate fury. But instead, something far more terrifying happened. Humanity went silent. Every human ambassador packed their belongings and walked away from their posts without a backward glance, leaving behind empty offices and confused alien colleagues who had expected tears or threats or at least some dramatic final speech. Every trade agreement was cancelled with cold efficiency, human merchants calling in their debts and closing their accounts and vanishing from stations where they had done business for generations. Every human ship in council space turned around and headed home, forming long convoys that wound through the stars like rivers of light flowing back to the ocean from which they had come. And then the communication buoys went dark. The bustling human districts on 100 different stations emptied overnight. Shops closing their doors and restaurants going silent and apartment buildings standing empty, like monuments to a friendship that had been murdered by council arrogance. Where once human music had played in alien markets and human laughter had echoed through foreign corridors, there was now only silence and dust and the fading memory of a species that had simply walked away. The Velthari thought it was funny at first. Archon Sylveth making jokes about human tantrums at diplomatic gatherings while his allies laughed, and congratulated themselves on finally putting the upstart species in their place. Let them sulk in their little corner of space, Sylveth declared with a wave of one of his four hands, because they will come crawling back within a decade when they realize how much they need us. Other species were not so sure, especially those who had traded with humans or worked alongside them or simply watched them with curious eyes over the centuries. The Krethri, a species of aquatic beings who had always found humans fascinating, warned that silence from humans was historically more dangerous than their noise. The Velthari ignored them. Years passed, then decades, and the crawling that Sylveth had predicted never happened. Probe ships sent to human space found nothing but automated warning beacons telling them to turn back or face destruction. And the few that ignored the warning simply vanished without a trace. Rumors began to spread through the galaxy like wildfire. Stories about what the humans might be doing behind their wall of silence. Some said they were building weapons that could crack planets like eggs, while others claimed they were developing new forms of faster-than-light travel that made council technology look like children's toys. A few darker voices whispered that humanity had destroyed itself in civil war or plague, that the silence was not defiance but death. The truth was both simpler and more terrifying than any rumor could capture. Behind the wall of silence, humanity had found a purpose that united every nation and every colony and every single human being who still drew breath. They called it Project Prometheus, named after the Titan who had stolen fire from the gods and given it to mortals. The greatest scientific minds on Earth and every colony came together in secret laboratories, hidden in places that no alien probe would ever find, deep in the hearts of gas giants and buried beneath the surfaces of moons and floating in the corona of the sun itself. They worked without rest, without rivalry, without any of the petty conflicts that had held humanity back for so long. A physicist from Nigeria collaborated with an engineer from Brazil and a mathematician from Japan. And together they solved problems that had baffled their species for centuries. Technologies that the Council had banned as too dangerous were explored without hesitation, because what did humans have to lose when the alternative was eternal servitude? They cracked the secrets of gravity manipulation and built engines that could bend space like paper, allowing ships to travel between stars in days instead of weeks. They developed new materials that were stronger than anything the galaxy had ever seen, alloys that could withstand the heat of a star's core, and shields that absorbed energy instead of merely deflecting it. They created new weapons that made the Council's most advanced military technology look like stone axes. Weapons that could tear through the hulls of enemy ships like they were made of wet cardboard. And they did something else, something that would have horrified the Council if they had known. They started the Prometheus Soldier Program. Volunteers from every colony stepped forward to offer themselves for transformation. Ordinary men and women who loved their species enough to become something more than human. The process was painful and dangerous, killing nearly half of those who attempted it, but those who survived emerged as living weapons with reflexes faster than thought and strength that could bend steel. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and they could see in spectrums that normal humans could only imagine. They could survive in vacuum for minutes at a time and heal from wounds that would kill any other being in seconds. They were humanity's sword and shield, created for a war that everyone knew was coming even if no one knew when it would arrive. Elena Vasquez, now in her 80s but still sharp as a razor, watched the 1st Battalion of Prometheus soldiers march across the parade ground of the training facility on Mars. She had given up diplomacy for a new role as the civilian liaison to Project Prometheus, and she felt pride swell in her chest as she saw what her species had accomplished in just a few decades. "They called us a developmental species," she said to the general standing beside her, "and said we needed to be protected from ourselves." She laughed, a sound that held no warmth at all. "I wonder what they would call us now." The general, a stern woman named Okonkwo, whose son had died on the Amalthea, smiled grimly. "They would call us terrifying, Ambassador, and they would be right." Years continued to pass, and humanity continued to prepare. Shipyards hidden in the clouds of Jupiter produced warships by the dozen, each one more powerful than entire Council fleets. The flagship of the new Terran Navy was completed in secret, a vessel the size of a small moon that carried enough firepower to glass a planet and enough soldiers to conquer one. They named it the Remember Amalthea, because humanity had not forgotten and never would. Children who had been born after the Withdrawal grew up hearing stories about the Galactic Council and what they had done, and they learned to hate with a cold patience that their grandparents would have found disturbing. These children became engineers and scientists and soldiers, pouring their anger into productive work instead of useless rage. They waited and watched and prepared, knowing that someday the galaxy would call for help and humanity would answer, not because they had forgiven what was done to them, but because they wanted the universe to see what humanity had become. And somewhere in the dark, the threat that would finally draw humanity out of their silence was already spreading. The Virkith swarm had returned to the galaxy, an ancient horror from the rim that consumed everything in its path. and it was heading toward the heart of Council space with an appetite that could never be satisfied. The Council had no idea what was coming, but humanity knew, because their sensor networks had detected the swarm years ago. They could have warned the Council, but they chose not to. They wanted the galaxy to suffer just a little before they arrived to save it. They wanted everyone to understand exactly how helpless they were without the species they had tried to cage. And when the time was right, humanity would return to the stars with fire in their hearts and vengeance in their eyes. The silence of soul was not surrender. It was preparation. And when it finally ended, the galaxy would never be the same again. 53 years after humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, the universe decided to remind the remaining species why they should have treated their former partners with respect. The Varkith swarm came out of the darkness between galaxies like a wave of hunger given form. Billions upon billions of creatures that existed only to consume and reproduce, and spread their terrible existence to every corner of the cosmos. They had visited this galaxy once before, 10,000 years ago, and the Council had barely survived by sacrificing 3 entire species to slow them down long enough for the survivors to build weapons capable of driving them back. But the swarm had not been destroyed, only scattered, and they had spent 10 millennia in the void between stars, growing and multiplying and waiting for the right moment to return. That moment had come. The HFY homeworld was the first to fall, and there was a certain terrible justice in that. The same species that had murdered 4,000 human colonists found themselves facing an enemy that showed even less mercy. Swarm ships descending on their cities like locusts and stripping the planet bare in less than a week. 6 billion HFY died screaming as creatures with too many teeth and not enough soul tore through their defenses, like they were made of paper. The Council scrambled to respond, but their fleets were scattered and their strategies were outdated, and their leaders were frozen with terror. 3 more worlds fell in the first month, then 7 more in the second, and suddenly the galaxy that had seemed so stable and permanent was looking very fragile indeed. Archon Sylveth had died of old age decades ago, replaced by his grandson Talveth, who was barely a century old and had never faced a crisis bigger than a trade dispute. Young Talveth sat on his throne in the Concord halls and watched the reports come in, each one worse than the last. And he felt the weight of 10,000 years of Velthari leadership crushing down on his shoulders. His advisors told him there was only one option left, one species that might have the power to turn the tide, but even suggesting it felt like admitting defeat. "We cannot ask the humans for help," Talveth protested weakly, "because they hate us and they have every right to hate us." "Then we will die," his chief military advisor replied bluntly, "because our fleets cannot stop the swarm and we have no other allies left." Talveth closed his eyes and remembered the stories his grandfather used to tell about the humans, how Sylveth had laughed at their withdrawal and predicted their quick return. That return had never happened, and now Talveth understood why. The humans had been waiting for exactly this moment, waiting for the galaxy to need them so badly that it would have to beg. He composed a message himself, choosing each word carefully while his planet burned on the view screens behind him. "To the people of Earth and her colonies," he began, "the Galactic Council requests your assistance in accordance with the mutual defense protocols that once bound our civilizations together." He sent the message into the void and waited. The response came 3 hours later, and it was exactly what Talveth had feared. "What protocols?" The message read, "We are not members of your council." Talveth felt despair wash over him like a cold wave, but he forced himself to try again. "Please," he sent back, abandoning all pretense of dignity. "Our people are dying by the billions, and we cannot stop them alone." This time the silence lasted for 2 days, and in those 2 days, 3 more worlds fell to the swarm, and the screaming of the dying echoed through the halls of every surviving civilization. Species that had looked down on humanity for centuries now sent their own messages begging for help, offering reparations and territory and unconditional apologies. The Crethri offered to name humans as the senior species of the Council. The few surviving Zethkai offered their complete surrender and eternal servitude. The Velthari, through Talveth himself, offered everything they had ever taken from humanity and more. And then, just when all hope seemed lost, a single human ship appeared at the edge of Council space. It was not like any vessel the galaxy had ever seen. A massive thing the size of a small moon that bristled with weapons that made no sense to Council scientists. Its hull was black as the void between stars, and its engines burned with a light that hurt to look at directly. Across its bow, painted in letters that could be read from orbit, was a name that made every alien who saw it feel a cold chill run down their spine. Remember Amalthea? Fleet Admiral James Okonkwo, son of the general who had watched the first Prometheus soldiers march across the fields of Mars, stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked out at the gathered council fleets with something between pity and contempt. He was tall and strong, and his uniform was simple and practical. Nothing like the elaborate costumes that council admirals wore. His crew moved around him with silent efficiency, Prometheus soldiers and regular humans working together in perfect harmony. He activated the broadcast system and spoke on all frequencies, his voice reaching every ship and every station, and every survivor hiding in the ruins of their civilization. This is Fleet Admiral James Okonkwo of the Terran Confederation warship, remember Amalthea. He let the name hang in the void for a moment. The Terran Confederation has observed the Virkith threat and analyzed its movements. His voice was calm and steady, the voice of a man who had no doubt about what he was doing. We have decided to intervene. A wave of relief swept through the council fleets, officers cheering and crying and embracing each other. But Okonkwo was not finished. Do not mistake our intervention for reconciliation, he continued, his voice growing cold, because we do not intervene for the council or for any of the species that once called themselves our masters. The cheering stopped. We intervene because the Terran Confederation does not allow genocide while we have the power to prevent it. He paused, and when he spoke again, there was iron in every word. We are not your saviors, and we are not your friends. We are simply the only thing standing between your civilizations and extinction. When this war is over, we will have words about the future of this galaxy. He cut the broadcast and turned to his first officer with a grim smile. Launch all fighter squadrons and bring the main weapons online. The Remember Amalthea began to move forward, followed by 200 more human warships that dropped out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. Council sensors struggled to make sense of what they were seeing. Ships that moved faster than physics should allow and weapons that registered as impossible on their instruments. The first swarm fleet to engage the humans lasted exactly 4 minutes. Gravity weapons crushed their bioships into balls of compressed matter, while particle beams cut through their formations like hot knives through butter. Prometheus soldiers in powered armor launched from boarding craft and tore through swarm warriors with their bare hands, their glowing eyes tracking targets faster than any alien could follow. Admiral Okonkwo watched the battle on his tactical display and felt no joy, only cold satisfaction. Signal all council vessels, he ordered, and tell them to stay behind our lines. His lips curled into something that was almost a smile. We would hate for them to get in the way. The war for the galaxy had begun, and humanity had returned to the stars not as servants or supplicants, but as the most dangerous force the universe had ever seen. The council had wanted them small and weak and dependent. Instead, they had created something that would reshape the galaxy forever. And Admiral James Okonkwo, standing on the bridge of a ship named for 4,000 murdered colonists, was going to make sure that no one ever forgot the price of underestimating humanity. The war against the Virkith swarm lasted 11 months. And in that time, humanity showed the galaxy what they had become during their 53 years of silence, where council fleets had been shattered in hours. Human warships carved through swarm formations like fire through dry grass. Their weapons cutting down bioships by the thousands, while their shields absorbed everything the enemy could throw at them. Admiral Okonkwo led the campaign personally, refusing to delegate the most dangerous missions to anyone else. He was there when they liberated the ruins of the Zethkai homeworld, walking through cities that had been stripped to bare rock and finding only bones where 6 billion people had once lived. He was there when they pushed the swarm back from the Krethri ocean worlds, his soldiers fighting in underwater environments that would have killed anyone who was not enhanced. He was there for every major battle, his flagship at the front of every engagement, his voice calm and steady on the communications network as he directed the greatest military operation in galactic history. The council species watched in stunned silence as humans did in weeks what their combined forces could not have done in years. Prometheus soldiers became the stuff of legend, warriors who seemed to move between heartbeats and struck with the force of collapsing stars. Stories spread of a single soldier holding a choke point against 100 swarm warriors, of squads that cleared entire hive ships without losing a single member, of men and women who walked through fields of fire like they were strolling through a garden. But the swarm was vast and hungry, and it had consumed 1,000 worlds before this one. So the war was not won quickly or easily. Humans died in the fighting brave soldiers and sailors who gave their lives to protect the galaxy that had once tried to cage them. Each death was recorded and honored, their names added to a memorial that grew longer with every passing week. The turning point came in the 8th month, when human scouts finally located the Swarm Queen. She was a horror beyond description, a creature the size of a continent that floated in the void and birthed millions of warriors every day. Her mind controlled the entire swarm, directing their movements and their attacks through some form of psychic link that even human scientists did not fully understand. Kill the queen and the swarm would collapse into chaos, their coordination broken and their will to fight destroyed. Admiral Okonkwo assembled the largest fleet humanity had ever created and led them personally to the queen's location, a system on the edge of council space where she had been feeding on the remains of a dead civilization. The battle that followed would be remembered forever. Thousands of swarm ships threw themselves at the human formation, dying by the hundreds to slow them down even a little. The Remember Malthea took hit after hit, its shields straining under the assault, its crew fighting with desperate determination to keep the great ship alive. Admiral Okonkwo stood on his bridge as it shook and buckled around him, and he never once showed fear. "All ships, focus fire on the Queen," he ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The human fleet unleashed everything they had, weapons that bent gravity and twisted space and turned matter into energy. The Queen screamed, a sound that echoed across the void and made every sentient being within light years feel a moment of pure primal terror. But she did not die. She was too large, too ancient, too filled with the hunger of 10,000 years of consuming worlds. Okonkwo looked at the damage reports and made a decision that would define humanity for generations to come. "All ships, fall back to safe distance," he ordered, and then he turned to his crew with calm eyes. "Except us." The Remember Malthea surged forward alone, its engines burning at maximum as it dove straight toward the Queen. Council observers watched in horror as they realized what the humans were doing. The flagship's weapons fired continuously as it approached, tearing chunks from the Queen's massive body. But still she lived and still she fought. At the last moment, when the ship was so close that it filled the Queen's vision entirely, Admiral Okonkwo gave his final order: "Detonate the core." The explosion was visible from a dozen systems away, a burst of light so bright that it burned the sensors of every ship watching. When the light faded, there was nothing left of the queen but drifting ash. And there was nothing left of the Remember Amalthea or her brave crew. The swarm collapsed immediately, just as the scientists had predicted, their warriors going mad without the queen's guidance and turning on each other in blind fury. The cleanup took another 3 months, but the war was effectively over from the moment that brilliant light bloomed in the darkness. When the last swarm creature had been hunted down and destroyed, the surviving species of the galaxy gathered in the rebuilt Concord halls to discuss what came next. But this time, they did not sit as masters of the universe. This time, they sat as survivors who owed their existence to a species they had once tried to cage. Ambassador Elena Vasquez walked into the chamber with her back straight and her eyes clear, despite being over 130 years old. Medical technology had kept her alive and sharp, because she had refused to die before seeing this moment. Behind her walked an honor guard of Prometheus soldiers, their enhanced eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the chamber. Every alien in the room felt their presence like a weight on their shoulders. Elena stood at the podium where Archon Sylveth had once announced humanity's demotion, and she looked out at the gathered representatives of 100 species who now waited in fearful silence for her words. 53 years ago, she began, her voice strong despite her age, I stood in this very hall and watched you cage my people. No one dared to speak or even move. You called us a developmental species, too young and too weak to be trusted with our own destiny. She paused and let the silence stretch. You murdered 4,000 of our children because they dared to dream of a new home. Talveth, the young Velthari Archon, lowered his head in shame. And when your sins came calling, when the darkness you could not face alone threatened to swallow everything you built, you came to us on your knees and begged for salvation. Her old eyes swept across the chamber, and every alien who met her gaze felt judgment in that look. We gave you salvation, but it cost us dearly. She thought of Admiral Okonkwo and his crew, heroes who would never come home. Now you must understand something very clearly. Her voice hardened into steel. The old council is dead, buried in the ashes of the worlds we could not save in time. What rises from those ashes will be built on equality, true equality, where no species is called lesser and no civilization is caged for the comfort of those who fear competition. She raised her hand, and the Prometheus soldiers behind her stood at attention. Or it will not be built with humanity at all. And I think you have learned what happens to galaxies that try to function without us. Talveth rose slowly from his seat, his forearms spread in a gesture of complete surrender. What would humanity have of us, Ambassador? Elena Vasquez smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had waited more than half a century for this moment. We would have you remember. Remember that peace is a gift that must be earned, not a chain to be placed around the necks of those you fear. Remember that the meek may inherit the stars, but only if they are willing to fight for the right to reach them. Remember that humanity asked for nothing but a chance to grow, and you tried to take even that from us. She turned and began to walk away, her honor guard falling into step behind her. At the door, she paused and looked back one final time. Build your new council, she said quietly, and do it right this time, because humanity will be watching. And we never forget. She walked out of the chamber, and behind her the galaxy began to rebuild itself in humanity's image. Not because humans had conquered it, but because the universe had finally learned what happened when you tried to cage a species that refused to stop reaching for the stars. The silence of soul had ended, and the age of humanity had begun.